Arcade Heroes.
Greetings, it's Adam with ArcadeHeroes.com, and as we finally arrive at IAPA, there's a bit of hype going on that I'm seeing amongst my colleagues for virtual reality. Now, I've discussed virtual reality in the past on the blog. I've shared stories on occasion from what they like to call LBE VR, in other words, location-based entertainment VR. It's a fancier way of saying arcade VR. But I don't always, sometimes I see it used as LBE, sometimes arcade. It's kind of interchangeable, as are a lot of the terms. Now, since I'd say 2014, 2015 or so, the presence of VR at trade shows has increased quite a bit, and as has the hype behind it, and you've probably gone to a modern arcade, particularly something like a Dave & Buster's, and found a VR system of some kind there, or maybe at some other family entertainment center. And the hype is continuing going into IAPA 2022, so I decided I wanted to discuss it a little bit. Also, in part, I got latest issue of Replay magazine, and in here there is a particular gentleman. His name is Bob Cooney. He's a VR guru, expert, specialist, whatever you want to say there, where he's also released a guide recently, the VR guide, or Bob's 2022 VR arcade guide. And between reading the article in Replay and seeing his many posts on sites like LinkedIn, I've seen where he's really pushing to advertise VR to arcade operators in general. And that's particularly what he does in the Replay article, where he's saying you need to think differently about how the ROI works for VR, and you need to invest in it. And I saw one post where he said VR is the next thing. And now, again, where I started off by mentioning that VR has been around in the arcade business for a while, and it's obviously been growing in recent times. Some have asked me what my thoughts are on this, and so I'll posit whether or not Bob's arguments have convinced me over from it, as I've started off a little bit skeptical on it. Particularly my first experience using a VR headset, I think, was around 2012, 2013, somewhere in that area. And I was at IAPA and used a VR headset. I can't remember which one it was. It would have been one of the first ones that was out on the market. But it's also tied to a motion system. I had extreme vertigo right off the bat, and also got stuck with a headache, and more like a migraine, and I'm not prone to migraines. And so for my first experience with VR, it was pretty negative, fairly poor. And over the years, most of those experiences have been like that. The only reason I've continued trying it is because I go to trade shows and I want to talk about it, so that I could say that I experienced something, so that I could share it with you, the readers or the viewers. Now, to be totally fair, it definitely has improved. When I used King Kong VR, which is by Raw Thrills, I think earlier this year, I did not experience any vertigo. I still get a little bit of a headache after I use any VR system, and so I'm not really sure why that is. Used to have glasses, got LASIK, and it seems to have improved on some of that stuff since then. But I know I'm not the only person to experience stuff like that, and so that would be an issue with VR with some people. But it's also just left me skeptical, but I'm also like to be a little skeptical about anything that comes along, as especially if it's touting to be the next big thing. And that, I'm not trying to say that I'm a Luddite or anything. I am very open to seeing new ideas come into the industry and change things up. That's one great thing about the arcade business, is that you can get some really cool ideas, and yeah, sometimes they are gimmicky, but if it's a good gimmick, oftentimes it can be copied for other things to use, and it can change the direction that the industry is going in and change how products are developed. Now, on this old article from 2016, I wrote this to help dispel some confusion surrounding all the different terms that exist out there. Now, to this day, as far as I'm aware, there's no real set definition of what makes something VR or AR or MXR, as sometimes those things are used interchangeably, although I'd say the confusion lies a lot more between AR and MXR, mixed reality, augmented reality and mixed reality, respectively. Whereas VR is pretty clear-cut. You put something on your face and it immerses you into the virtual world by blocking out most of the outside world. Oftentimes there's no headphones, or they put on a separate thing of headphones there, but either way, that doesn't seem to be much in dispute. I also brought up something that I called SR, simulated reality, which would include a lot of simulator-style arcade machines, as you see here, and of course just real full-blown simulators. But virtual reality, I talk about how that has the headset. If anybody's curious, how I posit augmented reality is that when you're using a device like a smartphone or say the old 3DS or AR goggles, where you may still put something on your head but you can see through it, and it's putting a digital overlays on top of that. I think the new Quest Pro is more augmented reality, but again, a lot of times for some reason people will call that mixed reality as well, and I can understand why, because it uses the term mixed. But I generally like to think of mixed reality as it's mixing, as they say here, mixes elements of both SR and AR together, thus blurring the lines. And I don't fault anyone for calling an MXR device a simulator or an AR application, but oftentimes something that seems to fit with mixed reality would be projection mapping. And so like if we look at this here, the old Sega heat-up hockey, which was mainly released in Japan. I think a few units found their way over here, but it projection mapped to the playfield surface, and that's also been done with pool tables. It's been done with sports simulators. Oh, I guess I gotta go back and fix that here. But any time where you have a projector displaying a digital overlay, in essence, is what I like to think is that fits mixed reality, because it's mixing the two together. But your definitions might vary as well, but that's what I will use in coming from this. Now, VR, what's the issue with VR that keeps me skeptical? Now, there was the health thing that I mentioned, and again, that has improved, but there is always still that little problem that I have. I know I've seen other people express this too, that using a headset that's been used in public comes with a tiny bit of risk. Now, I've used plenty of VR headsets at trade shows, and I've never come away with pink eye, and I haven't heard of many people that have, but it is a possibility. And now, fortunately, a lot of manufacturers will include things like Clorox wipes and these little face mask things next to the game so that you can wipe down your headset. But you have to be really, really thorough. So like if somebody who actually did have pink eye just used it and then you go and use it, if you don't super clean that thing, you could still end up getting something, even with the face mask thing. And I hate those face masks. If you've not seen them, they go right over your eyes, and it's this piece of cloth. I think it's similar to the material used in a surgical face mask cloth, but these ones, I guess, it's probably a better term to use, eye masks, which were developed to try and get around this problem or keep people from freaking out about it. But as far as I know, you could still end up getting pink eye or something like that from an improperly sanitized headset. And the reason why I hate those things is because they totally ruin the immersion when you use them, because that's the entire premise of VR, is to immerse you into the digital world. But when you have this cloth thing covering your eyes, and it's oftentimes smushed and crumpled, and especially when you're moving around, it gets kind of worse, and oftentimes it falls in front of your eyes. That's not immersing you. It's taking you out of it, very much so. And so that's why I hate them. And now, some other issues as I bring up here from 2016. A lot of stuff hasn't changed too much. As I mentioned here, the primary issue for VR has always been the cost. Now, they have made strides in this since 2016. Right here, I recently mentioned the Fury VR Solo debuting at IAPA 2022, and I also ran a story about another company that actually, VRarsenal is a company that built this cabinet, and they've licensed it out to VR Studios. So VR Studios is doing this Football Frenzy game, and VRarsenal is doing a Rhythmatic 2, which is a Beat Saber clone. And so from what I've heard, this cabinet is somewhere in the neighborhood of $25,000. And then, of course, going up from there, you have something that may be more like a traditional arcade machine where they've added the VR headset to it. And so, as another example, recent example, we have Asphalt 9 VR, where it's been modified from the deluxe version to focus entirely on first person there, and it still has a screen on it so that people standing around can see it, but then the person driving can just look straight through the headset. I don't know what the price is on this, but for similar systems, say like the Virtual Rabbids, I don't know why LAI doesn't have like a full-blown just cabinet shot of this on their site as they do on some of their other games, but you've probably seen this out and about before, the Virtual Rabbids. I want to say this is somewhere in the neighborhood of $50,000. The Raw Thrills King Kong machine, I've heard, is in the neighborhood of 40, closer to 45, somewhere around there. Trio Tech, which makes a lot of these dark theater, interactive theater things like the XD Dark Ride and a few other systems. They have one out called Storm VR. And as far as I know, most of those are in the realm of the $40,000 to $50,000 range. But I've also seen some systems prior to this new Fury cabinet. That company called VRarsenal as one example. Checking VRarsenal's site, they've actually scrubbed their older single-player cabinet from here as they just want to focus on Rhythmatic 2, but they have still been selling the Vader Immortal Lightsaber Dojo, and they used to have Beat Saber Arcade, and so this was their previous design. Just checking it out on the Primetime Amusement site, which does advertise on the Arcade Heroes site, but as I heard, these were somewhere in the area of 70,000, maybe 80,000. I should also mention Sega's VR Agent, which recently came out, and they did something unique where they fused the VR headset to the back of a light gun, and that was one where I tried using one of those eye masks first, and that didn't work, so I'd prefer to play that game with just without that, just make sure that it's clean. And I want to say that the VR Agent is in the 28,000 range from what I heard, but I never reached out to get a quote on that to be absolutely certain. And then stepping up from, say, your arcade cabinets, you might get these more elaborate simulator styles, but most of the other ones out there that you would probably see would be VR arenas, and where they've got these kind of enclosures or these canopies that generally hold the computers on top somewhere, and the players are tethered. They'll probably be using something like the HTC Vive. And these ones, while I've never received a full quote on all of these different arena-style ones, and there are some that are wireless out there and free roam sort of stuff, they're generally in the area of $100,000. And so those are kind of your tiers when it comes to different VR products out there. And so again, starting at $25,000, getting all the way up to $100,000, but a lot of them that you're seeing out there in the $100,000 range, it's just not something that works for an operator like me. And that's also not to mention the much higher maintenance costs. Now, this is one of the things that Bob Cooney is pushing back against in his replay article and saying, well, you got to rethink this. And the way I understand from how he posits it is he's using the concept that I used in a recent video where I was talking about pinball and why do I still have pinball and retro games when they don't really make a lot of money. Well, one, it's kind of filler. It helps me fill up the space, and it's generally cheap to get a hold of, although pinball's not becoming cheap anymore. It's becoming a bit overpriced and as to the value, but overall a benefit to something like pinball is indirect income. In other words, if somebody comes into my arcade place and they're looking around and they see something like a pinball machine that they really enjoy, they are likely to buy some tokens. Now, they may just spend it all on that pinball machine or the other pinball machines, but oftentimes they may be with somebody else, and that other person may not be interested in the pinball machine, but they'll buy tokens, and then that's indirectly bringing income in, so they'll go and play the other games too. Now, indirect income is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to track, because you just, especially with tokens. Now, maybe if I had a card system, I could do that. But then again, I would also need to know exactly what it is that brought the person in, and tracking that's something that you generally don't, information you don't get. And so that's I can understand that argument with VR, but to me, most VR, particularly the arenas, but even then, a lot of these mid-range ones that are in the, I don't know if this is in the $50,000 range, but let's assume it was, or again, like the King Kong and the virtual rabbits and all that doesn't scream arcade to me. That screams attraction. Attraction is a term that's used within the industry, and it's kind of self-explanatory. It's something that attracts people and brings them into a place, and so oftentimes that does create indirect income. And other examples of attractions would be things like bowling, go-karts, trampolines, although generally speaking, trampoline parks, that's the main attraction, and then they'll have things like an arcade on the side, or party rooms can be an attraction. And so I see most VR as fitting more into the small scale, maybe even medium scale attraction, as opposed to being a replacement for the arcade. As I mentioned earlier, I saw that Bob made a comment saying that VR is the next thing, and I've often seen comments, not just from him, but from some others, where they've been saying, well, this is going to replace the arcade. And I just don't buy that, because, I mean, even if you have something in the, oops, wrong link, if you have something like this, and let's say it's $25,000, now, if you're a small arcade operator like me, your budget's limited. The first thing that always is brought up when I ask other operators what their thoughts are on VR is they're like, well, for that price, I could get, say, like 4 Cruisin' Blasts and fill up maybe the same amount of space, maybe a little less or more, and make just as much money as I would with one of these. Now, of course, there are arcade machines out there, non-VR ones, that don't have that come with a $20,000-$30,000 price tag, and like, say, Halo Fireteam Raven Super Deluxe or House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn. But still, the average cost in an arcade machine these days is somewhere around $10,000, whereas I don't know what the average would be in that realm, between 25 to 100,000. It would just depend on how many there are out there. But still, there's this big price gulf. And as I also mentioned, there was the maintenance costs. I've talked with some FECs before with some of their technicians, where they were saying that they had so many problems with one of their VR arenas that they had to set up a separate WhatsApp group just to handle all the little issues that came up with that. And one thing that I also am not crazy about on, so like some of these things like the Vader Immortal, or a lot of them had these retractable headsets so that they wouldn't fall on the floor or get smashed into the game. And while I appreciate that they've made the effort to make something more affordable than, say, $70,000, I mean, the problem is this is going to be dropped on the floor a lot, or it could get hit against the cabinet. And anybody who knows the general public, if you're an arcade operator or you frequent arcades, you know that people are not nice to things. They oftentimes don't care if they destroy something. In fact, on some of my videos here, I know I've had to ask people to not be so rough on the stick shifters, because they'll jump on it and act like they are driving a real car, and they'll slam it as hard as they can. And I think those are in the realm of $100 to replace. Maybe it's less, I'd hope. But last I checked, that's what the price was. But a VR headset, oftentimes these are also even modified, so you have to go through the manufacturer of the game, and it's going to cost more than just going on to Amazon or eBay or wherever you get your VR headsets and buying a replacement one, because you need to get the modified version. And so that plays into the overall cost of it. Now, to a degree, I do agree with Bob's assessment that anything that you bring into an arcade, it's generally just moving money around, as there are a lot of operators who are balking at the idea of getting an expensive new VR game when they could get an expensive new redemption game, and they already know what a redemption game is definitely going to make, whereas VR may be a little bit more risky. And he's saying, well, if it's just moving money around, why does it matter? Is at least the gist of what I got. But, you know, the same could be said for an arcade video game. But also, like I had previously pointed out, most operators, when I ask them about this, they're like, well, how many other cheaper arcade games could I get for that price and end up making more money in the long run than having to deal with all the other issues that VR has. Now, I think Bob's response to that as well, it's an attraction, it's bringing people in, indirect income, but the right arcade game can be that too. You know, that's one reason why I got Maximum Tomb 5. It has its own indirect income effect too, because there are a lot of people that'll come in to play that, but sometimes when it's busy and since I only have 2 units and more than 2 people want to play, they'll go out and play other things while they wait. And so it really just comes down to, I think, the right game. But does that mean it's a replacement for that? Well, no. And especially even something like this, well, I guess to go to the extreme first, you can't put a VR arena anywhere. I barely even have the space here in my small 3,000 square foot store. Arenas are made for FECs, which generally have, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100,000 square feet. And it makes sense in those places, but would it really make sense to have, like an arcade can have, say, 200 games? Would you want to have 200 VR arenas? Or 200 of these? Now, I know the manufacturers would want that, of course, but you can't put this into some of the same places that you would be able to easily put an arcade, a normal video arcade machine, like, say, a gas station or a restaurant lobby, or maybe a movie theater lobby, because some of them have basically just normal arcades there. But the operator market is actually quite large, but it gets ignored the most in the industry. It's kind of weird. Everybody's always focused on the FEC. Now, I understand why manufacturers focus on the FEC, because they generally have the money and they're willing to spend it, and money talks, and everybody listens to that, whereas operators are generally going for the best deals and everything. But the other issue that this creates, that I also would complain about this from the non-VR arcade side, is that the more that you raise the ceiling of entry to get into this business, the worse it becomes for everybody. Now, I recently mentioned in my Arcade 1-Up video and to the trend that I'm starting to see of some businesses grabbing Arcade 1-Ups. Why are they doing that? Because it's cheap. It's a lot cheaper than buying the full-size machines. Now, there are some other issues at play there, which I've discussed in the comments and whatnot. But for me, when I started my business, as I mentioned, I do not come from a wealthy family, and I was working at a call center when I got started with this, or when I was doing my business plan, and I had to buy machines here and there over the course of several years before I had enough where I got to the point where I could then get an SBA loan to get some equipment for my arcade. And as I recall, my SBA loan was something like $33,000. And now that is a lot of money, at least for somebody like me who doesn't have that in his bank account or anything. But when I used to sell arcade machines, I would regularly talk with people who wanted to get quotes on $250,000 to start their arcade, or even once made a quote for one that was $2 million. And so the problem is, though, is that as prices keep going up, or the entry price goes up, it makes it a lot more difficult for people like myself, people who don't have the money right off the bat, to get into the business. And if everything was VR and all that pricing was starting at $20,000, $25,000, then it's just not something that your average Joe, so to speak, is going to be able to get involved in the business with. And again, this is also a criticism on the arcade industry itself. As I mentioned, the average cost of an arcade game right now is $10,000, and before the pandemic it was $7,500. And I would just really like to see more options out there that are under 10,000 than over 10,000. And just with VR, that oftentimes is the issue. Now, another issue, not quite as large as pricing, would be content. Now, I do give VR some leeway. It's still relatively new compared to video games, which have been around for about 50 years, so a little over 50 years. And of course, with arcades, I could throw out any sort of name and you'd instantly recognize that as starting in arcades, like Space Invaders or Street Fighter 2 or Contra or whatever. But there's not really much that's come out of VR yet that anybody on the street just knows. Beat Saber's probably the closest that we've gotten to there, but Beat Saber was available as an arcade for a time, but then Meta or whoever it is that owns that revoked the commercial license, and so nobody could do it anymore. And so now you're getting all these Beat Saber clones that offer virtually the same kind of play, maybe change it just slightly. But when you have a lot of clones of something, nobody's going to be thinking of the clone. They're going to be thinking of the original in those things. But there have been some concepts, like I've seen that earnings on stuff like Virtual Rabbids is pretty solid, King Kong as well. But I guess on the flip side there, the disadvantage is that because these machines are so expensive, the cost to play is so much higher. I mean, I get people complaining sometimes that they have to spend 25 cents to still play something, even though that's what it was for pretty much everything 40 years ago. But when you come to a VR machine, I mean, most of them, from what I hear, granted I don't have the numbers from everybody all over the place, but the most common one I've heard is $5 a play. And is that what you would want when you came to an arcade? Is that everything was minimum $5, if not more? Probably not. That wouldn't go too far, and depending on how much money you spend, you can just buy a headset for your house at home anyways. So there is that as an issue there. Let's see. But yeah, I mean, some of the content of VR has sucked. I guess what I'm kind of getting at. Not all of it. And I am glad that there are some innovative things being tried, like this football frenzy. It kind of baffles me that we haven't had something like NFL Blitz in a very long time in the non-VR arcade industry. And that's also weird to me because anytime I go to a trade show, I'm talking with developers, they're often talking sports. They know sports, they love sports, but they don't make sports games anymore. And some of the guys used to work for Midway too. They were there when NBA Jam and NFL Blitz were in development, and so it's just like, why don't you guys make a new sports game? You could. I mean, maybe it is that they just don't do well enough, and maybe it's VR that's needed to make it go forward. I don't know. That could be it. But there's stuff like that, and stuff like the aforementioned Asphalt Legends 9. It could be a good idea to be doing VR with racing, and which we've seen before. I've got some videos on my channel, like Overtake VR is one. Recently we talked about MotoGP VR being on test, and there's also Ultramoto VR by Eunice. And I also know at IAPA, speaking of Eunice, they are going to have a new VR product which combines a VR headset with something that's like Dead Storm Pirate, so you have a mounted light gun that you use to shoot at enemies, but of course everything's the display part of it is all through a VR headset. And so I mean, again, it's not as big an issue as price. It's just some of the VR stuff that I've seen just doesn't really have replay value. Who wants to, when every single VR game is, you're standing in a spot and you're shooting at all these robots or zombies that are coming at you. And zombies, it's one that, it's like every VR arena has a zombie game. And just after a while it gets a little stale, and so it's like, can you do something else with this? And so at least on the arcade side, they seem to be branching out on that, so I'm sure that'll come up. But that also reminds me, and this is kind of more on the price side of the argument, is that VR is still so new that you don't really have a lot of used VR stuff. That's one great thing about arcades, and also entry into arcades, like what I did to be able to start operating was everything that I bought was used up until I got my SBA loan, and then I was able to buy mostly new, but even then I still bought some used stuff. But with VR, there's just not enough out there that there's any sort of robust used market. There will be eventually, but it also depends on how many of these sell. And when you have prices this high, those companies are usually manufacturing and selling in the hundreds, not the thousands or tens of thousands like a lot of arcade machines have enjoyed. And so that does limit how many used that you're going to be able to find, if you can find any at all. While editing this, I realized I missed one other thing. And in Bob's article, he talks about how he used to work for Global VR, and at the time he was pushing really hard to start doing something that became very common in Japan, and that's revenue sharing, manufacturer side revenue sharing. In other words, the operator like myself would purchase the equipment, and then once it's in our place, then some of the revenues go to the manufacturer. And he's wanting to see this, or I believe it's already in place in some instances, where VR manufacturers will be able to take part of the earnings and be able to help recoup their costs. Now, from the manufacturer side, I do understand this concept because it's one way for them to be able to get a little bit more revenue out of the game after the initial sale. The problem is it's just not really friendly for operators, and in fact, I would say the program, if you want to call it that, has been a total disaster in Japan. And so it's completely destroyed the small operator there. As I mean, maybe it wouldn't be so bad if they didn't have to invest into the equipment plus the revenue share. And I know in Japan they have different tiers with certain games, like the most recent Gundam Pod sequel, the Bonds of the Battlefield 2. It did have 2 or 3 options where if you spent more to purchase it up front, then the amount of the revenue share would be less. but it was still a significant amount. But either way, I mean, as an operator, it's already tough where, especially if this is most of your business, if every single game I wasn't having to send some of that cut back to the manufacturer, that leaves a lot less for me. And there's a lot of bills to pay when you're running an arcade business: rent, wages, taxes, insurance, electricity, maintenance, and marketing, and anything else that comes with running a business. And so, like I said, in Japan, there are a lot of smaller operators that just couldn't afford to have so many hands in their pockets. And that's one thing that I noticed when I first got into business, is just how many hands want to get into your pockets, especially being a business. And so when I see that, it doesn't also excite me, the entire idea of a revenue share. Now, maybe if you didn't have to spend anything on the equipment, that would make it more. That'd definitely be a lot better of a deal for the operator side. And I also do think there are ways that manufacturers can still generate income for their games without having to do a per game or a revenue share or a monthly fee or something like that, and still be able to make something like, say, paid DLC, stuff like that. And I think some of the VR manufacturers have done that, where you can purchase packages or subscriptions. Those, I guess, would be my reasons for why I'm still skeptical, and why I also reject the notion that VR is going to replace the arcade, as I just don't see it. I mean, I do see it as being a companion to things, and if pricing can come down on some of this stuff, that would be great too, and then maybe a little more willing to try it. But ultimately, for me, what I would really like to see more development money go towards are things like AR and MXR. And the reason why is because, oops, I'm still on the issues tab there. But I mean, the simulated reality side we have down pat. And one thing I love about arcades is just how many variations of things you can do. There's lots of new things that we can still do with arcades. And one example I have is a Darius Burst Another Chronicle. It uses two monitors next to each other, glass, to make it look like one widescreen, or these days they could just get a 21:9 screen or something, and you can always come up with unique controls. And so that's one thing that always keeps arcades cool. Or the example of the old Sega R360 there, or these more elaborate simulators. Of course, these ones are in the $50,000-$60,000 range, so that's not something your normal everyday arcade is grabbing. But yeah, with augmented reality, and as well as mixed reality, you can. There's a lot of interesting things that I think can be done, but since so much of the development focus is going towards VR instead of these two, that makes it so that you just don't. We're not seeing quite as much in the way of unique things. Here's a popular one that's over in different Asian countries, where it overlays a digital thing on like a child or an adult, and they dance around. Although these ones have always been a little perplexing to me, because it doesn't seem to be like a game entirely. Like this one, I guess you can see you're trying to hit those little demon fairies or whatever they are. But yeah, could there be more done with something like that? Sure, why not? Or like Sega's Laser Ghost was an augmented reality game, really. Why not have, say, a screen mounted to a gun and having an overlay there? And that's basically what Silent Scope was, and that did very well, as I recall. I'm not sure how the newest one, the Silent Scope Bone Eater, did, but or you had attempts to experiment with auto stereoscopic 3D, like Let's Go Island 3D here, and there was the Swarm, my Global VR and shooter, that had 3D as a part of it, which I guess you could call augmented. But I also think that the possibilities with mixed reality are a lot higher. You know, you have things like your overlays your projection mapping onto pool tables and other surfaces. There was a game that I saw a few years back by Touch Magics called Mystery Island, where they projection mapped onto this odd-shaped mountain cone sort of thing, and the cone would move around and the graphics would move with it, and it was a very cool effect. But I don't think they ever actually released that one, so maybe it didn't test too well. But it's like there's still a lot of cool things you can try and experiment with, and see if it does something else that you can't do with a flat display. That again is the advantage of the arcade, is you can experiment with displays. You can do things with the displays that you can't do at home, and manipulate the image in certain ways that you couldn't do with a home TV setup, like Starblade as an example with that, was it concave or convex mirror, and other stuff like that I think stand out. And so why should VR take it all over and replace it entirely? I don't see it. Now, maybe you do, and so you can set me straight as to why I'm wrong as to the glories of VR and why I shouldn't be a skeptic. Or maybe you agree with me. I don't know. Either way, comment below and be happy to have a discussion. And thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts, and we'll see you on the IAPA preview video here tomorrow.